Hello, everyone. I'd like to introduce Magnus Vinding. He holds a degree in mathematics from the University of Copenhagen. And previous to that, he studied at Roskilde University, where he explored different fields such as physics, psychology, philosophy, history of science, and geology. He's the author of a range of books and topics in philosophy, from free will to epistemology, but his main focus is ethics and moral philosophy. He's written on veganism, moral truth, speciesism, artificial intelligence, effective altruism. But the focus of today's discussion is going to be suffering-focused ethics, which is the title of his latest book. So thank you, Magnus, for joining. And yeah, I hope this is be a good discussion.
Hope so.
So you open your book by saying the problem of suffering is the greatest problem of all, and that the most valuable project we could pursue is the reduction of extreme suffering. In fact, you have a little anecdote even in the book where I think just your engagement in philosophy in general, trying to find what would be the most meaningful project to pursue. And you said, I did not want this necessarily to be what I landed on, but it was what I landed on. And you argue that essentially ignoring our ability to help address extreme suffering is wrong. And that, quote, we're currently confronted with the possibility to reduce extreme suffering more than ever. And yet almost no one is talking about this, let alone examining the implications. So my question is, why do you think the problem of suffering is a neglected topic? And what would you say to someone to convince them that it's worth thinking about more in depth? My feeling here is that people do genuinely care about suffering, but what aspects do you feel are being overlooked, and what biases may be influencing our thinking?
Yeah, I think there are actually many reasons why we don't give it greater priority. I think so. One is that it's just extremely unpleasant to think about it. And so, I mean, if you could really appreciate the suffering of other beings at a deep level, you wouldn't be able to function in everyday life. So we all do need to push it away. But the sad thing is that we are, you could say, too good at pushing it away, in the sense that we almost deny its existence. I mean, it's something that both at an individual level and at a collective level, we suppress the existence of suffering almost, and especially the very worst of suffering. I mean, you don't generally see it displayed. It's generally just hidden from view, and like both in our media, but also at the level of our own minds. And I think one thing we can do to increase the priority that we devote to suffering is to make ourselves more aware of it, to become more aware of the fact that there is such a thing as extreme suffering. And I think in many cases, it can be sufficient just to consider individual cases of extreme suffering, and it becomes clear that this actually really does matter. And I think we usually do become quite impacted by it in the moment that we encounter it, but it's as though we tend to just hide it from view, that the next day you might have forgotten it again, perhaps because of quite an arduous effort at the level of our minds to actually actively suppress it. So yeah, I think becoming more aware of it, and also to consider the many arguments in favor of reducing suffering, which I outline quite a lot of those in my book, and I think they're actually quite strong. But yeah, again, back to some of those biases that you mentioned, I think it's generally not very interesting to talk about suffering, and it's also not a very good signal, generally speaking, to say, as a self-narrative that, well, my aim in life is all about suffering and trying to reduce suffering. I mean, it doesn't sound very cheerful. It doesn't sound very positive. It's just, all in all, it's not that pretty a story.
What do you think is the first step, or would be the most maybe effective way to raise awareness, if awareness is one of the biggest hurdles?
Yeah, I think there are many different levels actually that we can look at. So, for example, in terms of, there's the political level, which, however, tends to be quite crowded, but there's also the level of just philosophical arguments. So, like academic debate, there's actually a lot less academic work on the moral importance of suffering than you'd think. So I think this is at least one avenue where one can do very important work by developing and exploring arguments within the field of ethics. I think that's one very, very important, as mentioned, avenue. But then you also have things just such as, exposing people to real world cases of extreme suffering. And this doesn't necessarily have to even be, it doesn't have to be gory images, but just contemplating even just descriptions of some of the worst cases of suffering. I mean, I have a section in my book that is quite horrifying where I do describe some cases of extreme suffering. And I think, that's probably the most powerful section in the book by far, because I think it kind of, it breaks a certain thing almost in our minds, to describing these things, because it is as though we have kind of a barrier from these very bad things usually that we don't really, that prevent us from really connecting with the fact that things that are so bad in fact exist.
I think in terms of my own experience of first sort of engaging with ideas, it had to have been through Peter Singer with his arguments about extreme poverty. But I think for me, it wasn't just awareness that was the most compelling aspect, but it was the awareness combined with the call for action. And that even the most marginal use of resources can actually have a major impact. And I think while there are a lot of big questions around things like even wild animal suffering, where you can tend to get overwhelmed by just the numbers, I think knowing that you can still have these ripple effects is actually quite empowering. And so I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think you're quite right. I mean, I think that's something very positive, because it's like, it can be a helpful framing, because when you first are introduced to these issues, you can first feel very disempowered, right? It's so overwhelming. There's so much suffering in the world, but you can then also turn that around, or at least try to turn that around, and try to see an opportunity to reduce a lot of suffering, right? And to really, you can say, individually and collectively try to really get our act together, because it really matters that we do our best to have a positive impact and help other beings and reduce suffering, prevent suffering.
Yeah. Let's move into sentientism. So your work is in alignment with the philosophy of sentientism, which is essentially the moral consideration for the suffering of all sentience, all sentient beings. You write, quote, "An individual's species membership is not relevant to their intrinsic moral value, only their sentience is. Sentience alone is sufficient to warrant full moral consideration." So why, in your view, does sentientism often seem so radical or unintuitive when people first encounter that? And in a world where there's around 75 billion terrestrial farmed animals slaughtered every year, what can we do to advance our compassion there?
Yeah, good questions. I think, again, there are a couple of reasons why it seems so radical and so foreign to us. So first, I think at the biological level, we evolved to empathize with humans more so than with, say, rats or snakes. Right? So we are in some ways set up to empathize more with humans and also beings who are more like us. I mean, you can say that it's also easier to empathize with mammals than with fish, for example. And yeah, so concerning what we can do to advance the cause, I think, again, that an emphasis on philosophical arguments is actually quite important, and also, I would say, relatively neglected, because if you go through the facts, most people actually don't disagree that non-human animals can suffer. And they don't even disagree either that, I mean, so also at the level of values, people also do tend to agree that non-human animals deserve some moral consideration. But the question is then, if we can ask the question, well, what can justify that we discriminate against other sentient beings? So this is what's known as this the argument from species overlap, that whatever traits we can point to and say that this is the trait that non-human animals don't have and which justify that we can discriminate against them, that same trait we can also identify certain humans who may not have that specific trait, and yet people don't think that we are justified in discriminating against humans on that basis. And I think this is actually a very powerful argument that really challenges the way in which we, like our moral perception, you could say, and the barriers we draw within our moral perception. And I think that can really help us connect with the actual moral implications of the beliefs that most of us already hold, namely that non-human animals can suffer, and that, like, for example, it shouldn't matter what outside characteristics a sentient being has. It's essentially, yeah, that's an irrelevant trait. And what matters is that, just as we would say in the human case, what matters is that there is an individual there who has interests and who can suffer, feel pain and pleasure, and so on.
Yeah, I think that is a compelling point, and it's a beautiful one. And I'm curious what you would say to someone who perhaps they would counter with something like, "Oh, I'm only interested in a being that has this level of sentience, and so there's this gradient, and I think that there's a certain level where that would enable our moral concern." How would you respond to something like that?
Yeah, so I would say that might be among the more interesting arguments or counter arguments that you could bring up. But I would still say to that, well, in the case of, so first of all, what is your reason for thinking, for example, that most non-human animals fall below that given level of sentience, right? I mean, why do you think non-human animals, for example, suffer less than humans? Why wouldn't it be the other way around? As there are some arguments to that effect, like I present in my book about speciesism. And so, but that's one thing you could say. And then you can also say that, well, so how can you be sure, for example, that all humans fall above this threshold that you've identified, right? And so it again gets quite tricky, because that is almost no matter what you want to say, right? It's just, yeah, I would argue it's impossible to find something that allows you to include all humans and yet exclude, not necessarily all non-human animals, but to exclude, for example, all vertebrates, right? I mean, I would say as soon as you think all humans deserve moral consideration, or say all humans who have been born, for example, I would say that, yeah, then you really will be hard pressed to not also say that all vertebrates at least also deserve moral consideration.
You write, quote, that the vast majority of non-human animals comes into existence in a circumstance where they're doomed to live short lives full of frustrated desires, since thousands of beings are born where only a few can survive. And that, quote, even if we have no proposed answers to wild animal suffering, this would not give us reason to dismiss the issue. by analogy to the case of human poverty, the mere fact that this is a difficult problem does not mean that we should give up and do nothing. Wild Animal Initiative quotes a figure of 10 trillion wild vertebrates. How would you respond to skepticism concerning suffering? For example, something I've encountered quite a lot is the claim that, look, we don't know what the qualia are of these beings. We don't know the actual kind of neural computation that's in progress. Therefore, there's no definitive way to make any hard statement about their qualitative experience. How would you respond to that?
Well, I guess I would first ask the question about how is it different from the case of other humans. I mean, we also have, I guess, a similar problem there in a lack of certainty about how they exactly experience the kinds of things that happen to them. And so it's often thought of in terms of that, well, we can be quite certain about in the case of humans, but not really in the case of non-human animals. But I don't really I don't share that view that there's such a strong distinction. I mean, especially if you look at the degree of convergence in terms of like just brain structures that we humans have, and like, for example, other vertebrates have. I mean, we are talking about very similar basic structures that in humans happen to be bigger and more elaborate. And so the question is, why should it suddenly become so much more, like, for example, why should we suddenly have so much more moral concern in the case of humans just because we have a larger number of neurons in these various parts of our brains?
It's fascinating because and it is a difficult discussion if someone just is making the claim that, for example, a chicken just doesn't have qualia. It seems to me things like nociception would, and just observing behavior as well, would be strong evidence toward that they do.
Yeah, so there are many lines of argument that suggest that they do, right? You also have evolutionary reasons. There are also like shared neurotransmitters, but even also specific centers in the brain that are very similar across, certainly across vertebrates. And of course, there is still a lot of debate about this, but there are also, it's now, I think it's becoming more and more of a consensus. You know, there was this so-called Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness that was published back in 2012 by the world's leading neuroscientists, where they said that the neural correlates of consciousness were also present in other, like they included also birds, but also I believe other, even invertebrates, like for example octopuses.
Excellent. Yeah, I'll link that in the description. Do you have any view on near-term versus long-term effective projects there or methods there?
Yeah, so in terms of the near term, Animal Ethics has actually just published some videos about this, how we can concrete ways in which we can help wild animals. And one of them is, for example, vaccinations, actually, which is something that has already been done. So that's quite a nice example that this is, there's this proof of concept. Although the reasons it's been done so far has mainly been to, like, for other reasons than the well-being of the wild animals themselves. But it just shows the potential.
I'm curious now.
So, for example, there is the disease called rinderpest, which is actually now, I believe it's no longer existent because they actually successfully managed to, what's it called, like cure it for good. Also, there has been, I think there have been a few cases where they have vaccinated against rabies.
So vaccination may be one of the most effective near-term strategies.
It's certainly something that's very concrete and has been done already. But I think the long-term priority, and also like the more necessary thing to focus on at this point, is to just raise concern for the issue in the first place, and to argue that, make the case that this is actually something that merits priority. Because until we get to that point, we aren't going to be able to help wild animals on a large scale. So the problem of basically the human willingness to act, right? And that's, I think, where moral arguments do come in, like moral philosophy. And it is actually something that, in a sense, it's quite fundamental to engage at that level.
You argue for us to acknowledge the reality of suffering in other minds, and that this is a fact about the world as real as any other, regardless of who we are and whether we manage to connect with it. And that even things like the Golden Rule asks us to look at ethics from an impartial perspective, right? The Singer often mentions the point of view of the universe. So do you see solipsism, or whatever degree of solipsism that we have, as part of the problem, because we don't have this kind of direct access and experience of other minds? The reality isn't, as viscerally accessible.
So I think it's a good point when you say, so I interpret what you're saying is that, in a sense, we are, you could say, suffering solipsists, in that we don't really experience the suffering of others, right? And I think that's very true. Of course, in one sense, if we are very empathetic, we do, to some degree, experience the suffering of others. But of course, for most of us, most of the time, we are effectively suffering solipsists, right? We don't actually really experience what others go through. And in one sense, I think that's good. But in another sense, well, it's not good that we're not deeply aware of the existence, like, and prevalence of suffering. And I think, and this is actually a key point in my book, and one that I've stolen from the author Jamie Meerveld, which is that there's some good news, and that we can actually have this kind of awareness that there is a lot of suffering in the world, and that it's important to reduce it without necessarily suffering ourselves. And psychologists draw a related distinction between, on the one hand, affective empathy, which is, that you actually feel what others feel. And then on the other hand, compassion, which is the desire to see others' suffering alleviated and prevented. And so the point is that we can actually have compassion without necessarily suffering deeply ourselves, without being weighed down by excessive empathy.
One example you illustrate in the book, you echo Ursula Le Guin's famous "The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas," which is basically a story about a utopian city whose prosperity depends on the suffering of a single child. So I'm wondering, in what way might our situation currently be similar to Omelas? Amidst the kind of wealth and sort of luxury consumer culture that we have, are there some parallels to be drawn there?
Yeah, I think it's actually interesting to note how Omelas is very dissimilar from our world, because in Omelas you have this large paradise, and then you have this single being suffering in order for this paradise to be able to exist, right? And in this, like, the happy people in Omelas, they're really, really happy, right? But if you then try to compare that with this world, I would say that we have, I've described this before, it's just like reality is almost like an inverse Omelas scenario in some ways, because we humans, we exploit and abuse other sentient beings. Like, for example, if we just look at vertebrates, we exploit and kill, I believe, like 20 times as many vertebrates as there are humans every year actually. And so in that way, you have a large number of beings who are suffering in order to satisfy the needs. I mean, if we just look at humans and the beings we exploit in order to satisfy the needs of relatively few. And again, we can also compare like the experiences of individual humans, right? Who, like, unlike the people who live in Omelas, you could argue that people in the real world, like even people who are not miserable, are most of the time closer to a state of mediocrity than to being in a very blissful and happy state as the beings in Omelas. So I think there are actually many disanalogies there, and it's interesting then that people react so negatively to Omelas, but don't seem to see that they're actually, and maybe it's the identifiable victim effect, I don't know, but that our world is almost, no matter how you measure it, so much worse than Omelas.
I wonder if that ties into some of your work on the biases. Might there be any insight there?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, quite a few of the biases. So, for example, we have the bias called scope neglect, scope insensitivity. That when there are a lot of beings who are suffering, it's surprising that not only do we fail to care more when there are more beings, but there's actually psychological evidence to suggest that we tend to care less about a large number of beings who are suffering than even about a single being. And yeah, another bias that's quite relevant there is what I've called the novelty bias. And that we live in this world and we've gotten used to living in this world. So it's the fact that beings are getting killed by the millions every single day doesn't really hit us deeply. I mean, it's not something that really, even those of us who are aware of it, I mean, we still have to live our lives. And so there's this wonderful quote from, I think I forget his name right now, but the quote is that custom will reconcile people to any atrocity. And in that way, when something happens every single day, it's almost impossible to really feel that it's an atrocity and it's something that's urgent, that we do something about it.
Sounds similar to the banality of evil concept.
Yeah, it is very similar. Also in that, yeah, it's also just deeply cultural, right? So we just simply get used to whatever surrounds us, and we get quite numb to it, even if we think it's a problem.
Are there ways of overcoming that bias other than awareness?
Yeah, I mean, so again, back to this thing about affective empathy and compassion, it might be good to some extent that we are, that we get somewhat hardened, and it might be best that we actually, that it's mostly a cerebral insight that things are bad, and that it's really that there is an ongoing atrocity, and that it's important that we act. But perhaps we shouldn't. I mean, because there can be a danger in getting too weighed down and burning out.
Sure. So on that point, you write that, quote, some pockets of the universe are in a state of insufferable darkness. Such suffering is like a black hole that sucks all light out of the world. And yet there's a form of light whose value does compare to this darkness. And that it's the kind of light we should aspire to become, the light that brightens and prevents the unendurable darkness of the world. So, first of all, I find that a very positive and beautiful view. Some suffering-focused ethical views result in, seems to me, anti-civilization and anti-life stances. But you've written, quote, it should be better to allow sentient life to keep existing without extreme suffering. We should seek to engage with others in kind and cooperative ways so as to increase future concern for suffering, and in particular, to reduce the risk of worst-case outcomes that contain astronomical amounts of suffering. So my question to you is, how can we pursue the project of civilization and all the flourishing art, science, insight, communities, relationships in tandem to this project of addressing suffering? It seems to me some make it out to be a zero-sum game. My intuition is that they should happen in tandem, but there needs to be, a greater weight on addressing extreme suffering. So what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think this is actually, it's a very important question that you raised there. And I think it's one of our main challenges to integrate a strong motivation to reduce suffering with a balanced, healthy, wholesome lifestyle. Because the reality is that none of us are hyper optimizers who can just always work single-mindedly on one thing. We also need to work in sustainable ways, and we need balance in our lives, and we need to remain motivated and be reasonably happy about what we do, right? And so I think in that way it is very instrumental that we actually pursue other things, and that other things are in fact very instrumentally important. I mean, even things that don't necessarily seem very important, like for example having a healthy, balanced lifestyle and having good relationships. I mean, it's just absolutely key, right? It's one of the more solid findings in modern psychology is that balanced social relationships are extremely important for our well-being and in turn also for our productivity.
You claim that we greatly underestimate our ability to reduce suffering, and that not only can we measure suffering, but how we can best reduce suffering is ultimately a scientific and potentially engineering question. For example, through technologies that could make us wiser, more compassionate, and in general, better motivated and able to reduce suffering. So my question is, how can we raise awareness of our potential impact?
Right, I think I should just clarify on the points about measuring suffering and also the points about like having a science of reducing suffering. I think my view isn't that we can measure suffering very precisely. I think that's a point I also make in the book, that but despite the fact that we can't measure it precisely, my point is that we can still make reasonable efforts to actually reduce suffering. The extent to which it's a scientific question, I would again say that that is my view, but it's not as though it can never be an exact science. So I think those are important points to make there, that we're always dealing in like probabilities, and there's always going to be a lot of uncertainty about what in fact is going to have the best consequences. I think one important thing, and also something that I have an entire chapter on, although it's a fairly short chapter in the book about, is about research. Like, we really do need to build a research project, because there really are many open questions. And as I think my book makes clear, it's actually quite complicated in many ways. Like, there are many different considerations to weigh and balance. And so I think it's really crucial that we get as many of the relevant considerations on the table as we possibly can, because I think there are some serious risks that we might be missing something very important.
I actually have a quote by you on that, which is that such research should be, quote, hierarchical, and that it should prioritize exploring the ideas and questions that seem most relevant, and recursive, and that new discoveries should continually update our future research directions.
Yeah, and so it comes back to, it's basically just to adopt a scientific mindset, which is of course something that is quite foreign to us by nature, right? I mean, we tend to embrace set views and then to endorse them strongly and identify with them, rather than to embrace the inevitable uncertainty that is just, insurmountable But I think this is a very common thing, actually, for people who are focused on reducing suffering, that they identify a certain cause, a certain issue, and they then go all out on that, so to speak, rather than to take a step back and reflect on, well, like, and actively question, is this really the best thing I can do in relation to my ultimate goal? And it's very common for people to find a certain cause and then stick with that. And of course, there's a lot to be said in favor of that, right? Given that there's so much, like, for example, if you already have identified a very promising cause, and especially also if you build up knowledge and experience within that course area, I mean, it does make sense to continue, or at least it is a reason to continue to pursue that cause. But I think it is extremely neglected, this taking a step back and trying to reflect broadly about how we should ideally act. And I think this is really something, it's also something that's not particularly pleasant to do. I mean, it can really be rather taxing, which is another reason we probably do it a lot less than we actually should. An example could be, for example, that a person who identifies veganism as the main cause to be working on, and then because they go down that path and they go all in, they don't necessarily see that there are other issues, like, for example, wild animal suffering, which suggests, well, I've argued that perhaps focus more on anti-speciesism rather than, for example, veganism in particular, because anti-speciesism actually implies veganism, but it also implies taking wild animal suffering seriously. But beyond that, you can then also say, well, there's this issue of S risks, and like, which is risks of astronomical future suffering, how things could turn out really badly. And that's also something that merits some consideration. And even just starting to think about that can change your priorities and approach in some significant ways. Like, for example, thinking about that makes it clear that it's a good idea to pursue a very cooperative approach, because not doing so, likely has very, very bad consequences.
So you founded just recently, congratulations, by the way, a Center for Reducing Suffering. Would you say that philosophy, that taking a step back and really thinking critically, is its core driving force or mission?
Yeah, it's quite fair to say. So actually we have two missions in a sense. So one is at the level of normative ethics, that we develop and explore suffering-focused views and arguments. And another part of our mission is that we try to figure out what our priorities should be. So, and again, this is not like, it's not anything like an exact science, but it's still something that we, in fact, most likely can make real progress on, and which does give us some action guiding insights. Yeah.
What would you say is the most underappreciated or neglected area, perhaps in the EA community or just in general?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, so I think generally it's a fairly small minority, I think, in the effective altruism community that sees the problem of suffering as being like the main priority. So there's this there's a strand within the movement that you can identify as being a suffering focused strand, and they do have this focus. But I would say in the EA movement at large, I would say it doesn't actually really have that focus. Well, I think actually a majority of people who are, at least in the broader effective altruism movement, they are focused on alleviating poverty, human poverty. And so, and yes, I'm not, as people get more and more involved with effective altruism, they tend to move to other causes than poverty. A lot of people move on to working on, for example, animal welfare, but I think even among people who are focused on animal welfare, I don't think it's a majority that at least explicitly frame it in terms of like it's the problem of suffering that's the main problem. Although I suspect many would agree with that on reflection. But this is actually another point that I've tried to make in the context of effective altruism, is that I think there isn't as much reflection on fundamental values that I think there should be, because ultimately our core values are going to determine our priorities in the end. And so that renders them rather important.
Hopefully this discussion will raise some thought there and awareness.
Yeah, we may hope so. And I should also make clear that when I say this, it's not, I don't mean to say this just to imply that, well, people haven't considered the kinds of arguments that I find compelling, and if only people considered those, then they would agree with me. But the point is that there is, I mean, no matter what view you have, whatever values you'll end up with, I think this process of critical reflection is crucial either way. So to be fair, there's kind of a counter argument there which says that, well, but for example, don't most people already agree to a significant extent on what is good and what is bad? And shouldn't we just, rather than sit around and just think and reflect all day, shouldn't we actually go out and do something? And I can certainly, I mean, I have a lot of sympathy for that view, right? Especially given how much there is to do in the world, how much there is to improve. But nonetheless, I think if we are to be systematic in our efforts to improve the world, and if we are to prioritize in really well considered and reasonable ways, I don't think there is a way around going deep down into the philosophical trenches, so to speak, and really explore these issues of core values.
So Magnus, wrapping up, is there anything that we haven't covered yet that you'd like to reflect on?
We already touched on it, but this issue of being open, like both at the level of core values, but also at the level of, at the practical level, where it's more, scientific openness. But in both cases, I think it's really important to explore these issues with a lot of openness. And I think it's very important to emphasize that, because it just doesn't come natural to us at all to be very open-minded. I mean, we do tend to get set in our ways, and I think there are also various biological reasons for this, that, I mean, to really think about all the different ways in which, for example, we might be able to prevent suffering, and also the many different ways in which, for example, new kinds of suffering might emerge in the future. I mean, there are a lot of possibilities there. And to consider all these possibilities, I mean, it is just really, it is quite overwhelming. And hence, it's very tempting to just choose something that you focus on. But I think it is important that at least some people resist that temptation and do some more reflection on these issues. So to really just admit that, well, for example, in the context of how we can best reduce suffering, there are a lot of open questions about this, and we should approach these questions like impartial scientists to the extent that we can.
Excellent. Well, Magnus, thank you for doing this. We should totally do this again sometime.
Yeah, totally.
Have a great day. Good luck with everything.
Thanks, Graham. Likewise.